Welcome to Global Studies 9.
The Roman Empire. Section 2. So, the Roman Republic begins to collapse. As the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And there's a specific incident that really speeds up this fall of the Roman Empire, Roman Republic, and this is when two tribunes, so the tribunes, a reminder, are those who spoke on behalf of the plebs. They were murdered because they tried to speak up for the plebeians, and soon enough the Republic is in the middle of a civil war. During this time, we also see the military become less and less disciplined. Soldiers are beginning to show loyalty towards the general instead of the Roman Republic. And this also becomes an issue later on as we see the rise of dictator Julius Caesar. So by 60 BC, there's this triumvirate, three people that have decided to work together in order to keep their own power. And this is Crassus, who had a lot of money. We have Pompey, who was a former general who had a lot of political connections. And finally, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a very interesting character. In his early years, he was not a tactical genius, but he was very charismatic. And as a general, his soldiers loved him, and he had a legendary battle against the Gauls where his military was able to defeat the Gauls despite being outnumbered 5-1. And this was known as the Gallic Wars, where Rome was able to secure more access, more land, and through this victory, Rome was a major turning point because it really showed the superiority Rome had in comparison to surrounding areas. Now we see a splinter beginning to form with this first triumvirate around 50 BC when Pompey starts to feel like Julius Caesar becomes a threat. And this begins when Pompey says that when Caesar returns back to Rome, he can't return with his soldiers, that he has to return alone. Caesar chooses to ignore this and returns back to Rome with his soldiers. So Caesar ignores these commands by Pompey and brings troops to Rome, and they're able to take over by force. And by 44 BC, Julius Caesar is no longer consul, but he is dictator for life.
Only this, that you join with me in building a new Rome, a Rome that offers justice, peace and land to all its citizens, not just the privileged few. Support me in this task, and old divisions will be forgotten. Oppose me, and Rome will not forgive you a second time.
As dictator, Caesar made various reforms, such as granting wider citizenship, creating jobs for the poor, and a lot of these utilitarian changes were attempted, but some never occurred. And they were very popular among the people, but not very popular among those in power, because this meant more power for everyone and less power concentrated at the top. Julius Caesar would go on to rule with an iron fist, using everything necessary to lead as a dictator, and he was very ruthless against those who went against him. Now, an interesting side story is the relationship of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. So at the time, Cleopatra was in charge of Egypt, and they had an intimate relationship. And this intimate relationship helped forge a strong bond between Egypt and Rome. Now, Caesar's assassination is a very famous event in history, also remembered as Ides of March. This day, senators came together, a group of senators who were worried about Caesar's dictatorship, and they assassinated him. It's believed that he was stabbed many times by many different senators, and here's a famous illustration showing it. Also, here's an interesting clip from HBO's Rome. These senators, it was said that these assassins, so the senators, weren't very skilled with daggers, and a lot of them actually ended up injuring themselves in the process. So it was a very sort of dirty and not so clean process of assassinating an individual. So following the assassination, the assassinators called themselves liberators because they believed that they were liberating the Roman people from the dictator Julius Caesar. But it turns out that most people were actually angry at the assassins, and they did not feel like they were being liberated. And this began a civil war between those who are part of the second triumvirate, so people who were sympathizers of Julius Caesar's, like Lepidus, Mark Antony, and Octavian, against the others in Rome. And the two main conspirators, Brutus and Cassias, fled, but they are eventually caught and they were killed. So the people were not very happy with the senators who assassinated Caesar, and Rome was now under the rule of three people who were used to be close to Julius Caesar: Mark Antony, Octavian, Marcus Lepidus, otherwise known as the Second Triumvirate. Now, like the First Triumvirate, this friendship eventually falls apart. And here's a quick background of the three. So Lepidus was the least charismatic. He was given lands in Africa to look over, and after several years, Octavian and Mark Antony turned their back on Marcus Lepidus and took over his lands. Mark Antony was given the eastern parts of the Roman Empire, and that's where he would meet Cleopatra, the former lover of Julius Caesar, and he would actually end up marrying her and having some children with her and staying in that area. Finally, Octavian, perhaps the most ruthless and most Machiavellian among the three, was the one to eventually take over all of Rome. And he starts off by teaming up with Mark Antony to take over the lands of Marcus Lepidus.
And the West. And I will make do with Egypt and the eastern provinces. What would I get? Yes. Africa.
Now, although Mark Antony and Octavian worked together to defeat Lepidus, this is only a temporary truce between the two. And in fact, when they are fighting together, this is the beginning of the deterioration of their relationship, because Mark Antony would go on and do things without asking Octavian, and when Octavian would do things like undermine Mark Antony, for example, by sending troops to him, but sending much fewer troops than they promised. Eventually, Octavian betrays Mark Antony, and he uses a strategy of getting people on Rome on his side by saying that Mark Antony is, more loyal towards Egypt and not really loyal towards Rome. And this is especially effective when he's able to somehow get his hands on Mark Antony's will that states that most of his territory are going to be left for his sons and not for the people of Rome. And another thing that angered a lot of people in Rome was that Mark Antony's will said that he preferred to be buried in Alexandria of Egypt and not in Rome. Eventually, this leads to the final war of Republic, and Octavian is victorious and now is leading Rome as dictator. So an interesting side story is between Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The two met when Cleopatra was still 14 and Antony was a young soldier traveling through Egypt. Eventually, the two got married, and this really angered Octavian because at the time, Mark Antony was already married to the sister of Octavian and got divorced with her in order to get married with Cleopatra. The two's love affair is known as a tragedy because of how it ends. So once Mark Antony loses that final battle with Octavian, Cleopatra is misinformed that he had died. So Cleopatra ends up committing suicide through having a poisonous snake bite her. Hearing about the suicide of Cleopatra, Mark Antony also commits suicide himself with a sword. So the second triumvirates fell apart, and now Octavian rules Rome. So the Roman Republic becomes a Roman Empire, now with emperors, so one person instead of two consuls in charge. Egypt is now part of the Roman Empire. And finally, Mark Antony and Cleopatra are now dead. They've both committed suicide.
let's use a proper Roman sword.
Mark Antony committed suicide with sword. Cleopatra committed suicide with a poisonous snake. The Roman Republic is now dead, and Rome is now controlled by one single man, Octavian, otherwise known as Augustus Caesar. And this is also the beginning of Pax Romana. There's a copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.